I still remember the exact moment everything in my family stopped feeling like Christmas. Even though the lights were glowing, the tree in my Connecticut home was covered in gold ornaments, and the entire house smelled like cinnamon and baked apples. My name is Margaret Collins. I am 68 years old, and I had spent years believing that if I gave enough of myself, my family would always stand together. That evening, I hosted what I thought was a perfect holiday party, inviting close friends, relatives, and my son Daniel Miller along with his wife Jessica Miller, who always carried herself like she belonged at the center of every room. I had prepared everything in detail, from the catered dinner costing over $2,000 to the imported wine I personally selected, all in my effort to keep the tradition alive. For years, I had quietly covered expenses that no one ever questioned: the mortgage of the house, the renovations, even the private school tuition for my grandchildren, all while telling myself that this is what love looks like. But love, I would soon learn, can be mistaken for obligation when no one is paying attention. The evening began with polite conversations and laughter that echoed through the living room, but I noticed Jessica's tone toward me was different that night, sharper, more intentional, as if she had been waiting for an audience. As guests gathered around the dining table, glasses were raised and holiday wishes were exchanged, she suddenly leaned back in her chair and, with a smile that did not reach her eyes, called me a burden in front of everyone, as if I were something that no longer belonged in the picture I had built my life around. The room froze in a way I had never experienced before, conversations collapsing into silence, forks stopping midair, eyes shifting uncomfortably between me and her. Daniel looked down, avoiding my gaze, and in that moment I understood something painful but clear. No one was going to speak for me. I did not respond immediately, not because I was weak, but because I had learned over the years that silence can sometimes carry more weight than anger. I looked around the room slowly, watching. Familiar faces pretend they had not heard what had just been said, and I realized that the foundation I thought I had built for my family was not as solid as I believed. Inside me, something shifted, not in rage but in clarity, because for the first time I saw how invisible I had become in my own home despite being the one who kept it standing. Jessica continued smiling as if nothing had happened, unaware that the story she believed about me was about to collapse under its own weight, and I quietly set my glass down, understanding that this night would not end the way she expected. I remained seated for a moment longer than anyone expected, holding my glass without lifting it, while the weight of what had just been said settled deeper into the room than the holiday music playing softly in the background. The guests avoided direct eye contact with me, as if looking away could erase the tension that had already taken shape in the air. Jessica Miller continued to sit across from me, her posture confident, almost satisfied, as though she had finally spoken a truth she believed everyone already accepted. My son, Daniel Miller, still did not look up, his hands resting near his plate, frozen in a way I had seen only a few times in his adult life when he did not know how to respond. I slowly placed my glass on the table, not with force, but with a calmness that felt unfamiliar even to me, and I realized that the version of myself they had all grown comfortable overlooking was no longer willing to remain invisible. I thought back over the years, not in anger, but in a clear sequence of memories that suddenly no longer felt disconnected. I remembered the mortgage payments made quietly each month, the checks signed without discussion, the renovations that kept this very house standing strong, and the tuition payments for my grandchildren that arrived on time every semester without anyone asking where the money came from. I remembered how often I was thanked for small gestures, yet never acknowledged for the foundation that supported every large comfort they enjoyed. Jessica leaned slightly toward Daniel as if expecting him to validate her words, but he remained silent, trapped between loyalty and discomfort, unable to step into the moment unfolding in front of him. Around the table, conversations had not resumed. Instead, there was a stillness that made every breath feel noticeable. I finally stood up slowly, not in haste, but with the careful control of someone who had spent years learning how to remain steady even when ignored. I adjusted my hands on the back of my chair and looked across the table, not at Jessica first, but at everyone else, because this was no longer a private misunderstanding. It had become a shared moment of truth whether they were ready for it or not. I spoke in a calm voice, measured and steady, explaining that being called a burden in a house I had financially sustained for years did not reflect reality, but rather a misunderstanding of who had actually carried the weight of this family. I did not raise my voice, I did not argue, I simply stated facts as they existed, each one landing quietly but firmly in the space between every guest. I saw confusion first, then disbelief as people began to process what I was saying. Jessica's expression shifted slightly, her confidence beginning to waver as she realized this was not a confrontation she could dismiss with attitude alone. Daniel finally looked up, his eyes searching mine as if trying to reconcile the words he was hearing with the life he thought he understood. The atmosphere in the room changed not through noise, but through realization, as the narrative Jessica had presented began to crack under the weight of what could no longer be ignored. I did not need to shout or accuse, because the truth itself was already beginning to speak louder than anything else in the room, and for the first time that evening, I understood that silence had served its purpose. I stood there in the center of the dining room, feeling the quiet pressure of every gaze that had once been casual now turning heavy with curiosity and disbelief, and I could sense that the atmosphere was no longer controlled by confidence but by uncertainty. Jessica Miller shifted slightly in her chair, her earlier composure beginning to fracture in small but visible ways, as if she had not anticipated that her words would not end the moment they were spoken. My son, Daniel Miller, finally lifted his head again, his eyes moving between me and his wife as though he were trying to find a version of this situation that made sense without forcing him to choose a side. I did not rush my words because I knew that truth, when spoken carefully, does not need urgency to be felt. I simply continued speaking in the same steady tone, explaining that for years I had contributed to this household in ways that were never discussed openly, not because I wanted control, but because I believed it was what family required during difficult financial periods. I mentioned how the house in Connecticut had been maintained through my payments, how property taxes never missed a deadline because of me, and how even the large renovation 3 years ago had been fully funded without outside assistance. I could see subtle reactions forming around the table as guests began to quietly compare what they were hearing with what they had assumed. Jessica attempted to interrupt with a light laugh, trying to dismiss my words as exaggeration, but her voice lacked the same certainty it had carried earlier. I turned my gaze toward her calmly, not aggressively, and allowed her interruption to fade without resistance, because I understood that facts do not require permission to exist. I then added in the same steady voice that the private school tuition for my grandchildren had been paid directly by me for several years, and that every invoice, every confirmation, and every financial record could be shown if anyone doubted what I was saying. The room became even quieter, not out of drama, but out of processing, as people began to realize that the structure of the family story they had believed might not be accurate. Daniel's expression tightened slightly, not in anger but in shock, as if he were hearing details of his own life for the first time. Jessica's confidence continued to weaken, her posture shifting from relaxed to rigid, her hands now resting still on the table instead of gesturing as before. I did not look away from her when I spoke next, but I also did not raise my voice, because I did not need to compete with emotion when clarity was already doing the work for me. I said that being called a burden in a home that I had financially supported for so long was not only hurtful, but also disconnected from the reality of what had actually been sustained behind the scenes. At that moment, I could feel the shift in the room becoming irreversible, not because of confrontation but because of recognition. Guests who had been silent began to exchange small glances, as if reassessing what they thought they understood about the family standing in front of them. Jessica finally lowered her gaze for a brief moment, and in that silence, I understood that the narrative she had tried to project was no longer holding its shape in the presence of facts that could not be avoided. I could feel the entire room shifting in a way that no one had planned, as if the air itself had become heavier with every sentence I had spoken, and now even the smallest movement carried meaning. Jessica Miller sat very still, her earlier confidence replaced by a tension she could no longer hide, her fingers lightly pressing against the edge of the table, as though she needed something stable to hold onto. Around us, the guests were no longer simply observers of a family gathering but silent witnesses to something they were beginning to reevaluate in real time. I noticed how some of them were no longer looking at Jessica with the same certainty they had before, but instead with a mixture of confusion and reconsideration, as if the foundation of their assumptions had quietly shifted beneath them. My son, Daniel Miller, finally spoke, but his voice was uncertain, almost fragile, as he asked if what I was saying was truly accurate, not in accusation but in disbelief, as if he were afraid of the answer either way. I turned slightly toward him, not with frustration, but with a calmness that came from years of carrying truths without being asked about them. And I simply told him that every statement I made could be verified through financial records, bank transfers, and official documents that had existed long before this evening. That was when Jessica attempted to regain control of the moment, leaning forward and insisting that I was exaggerating, her tone sharper now, but no longer as steady as it had been earlier in the night. She tried to frame my words as emotional misunderstanding, suggesting that I was misinterpreting contributions and responsibilities, but the difference now was that no one immediately supported her interpretation. Instead, there was hesitation, a pause that stretched longer than she expected, and in that pause I saw something change in how others perceived her certainty. I did not raise my voice or argue, because I understood that the more composed I remained, the more space the truth had to settle on its own. I simply continued, explaining that financial responsibility is not defined by who speaks about it, but by who actually fulfills it consistently over time, and in this case I had been the one maintaining stability in ways that were not visible at social gatherings. I mentioned specific examples without emotion, including annual property tax payments that exceeded $12,000, household maintenance costs that often surpass $5,000 per year, and educational expenses that had been quietly managed without public acknowledgement. Each detail I shared was not meant to attack, but to clarify, and I could see the effect it had on the room as understanding began to replace assumption. Jessica's expression tightened further, and for the first time she did not interrupt immediately, as if she was beginning to realize that denial would not be enough to reverse what was already being understood by everyone present. Daniel looked down again, this time not out of avoidance, but out of internal conflict, as though he was trying to reconcile two versions of his reality that could no longer exist at the same time. The silence in the room was no longer uncomfortable in the same way it had been earlier. Instead, it had become reflective, heavy with the process of people adjusting their understanding of what they had believed about our family. I remained standing, not out of defiance, but because I no longer felt the need to shrink my presence to maintain peace, and in that stillness I realized that the balance of power in the room had already begun to shift without any further words being necessary. I remained standing in the same position, not because I wanted to dominate the room, but because I no longer felt the need to shrink myself in order to make others comfortable, and that realization alone changed the energy around the table in a way that no one could ignore. Jessica Miller sat motionless now, her earlier attempts to interrupt or reinterpret what I had said completely replaced by a quiet tension that was becoming more visible with each passing second. I could see her eyes shifting slightly, not meeting mine directly anymore, but moving around the room as if searching for anyone, who might still support her version of events. My son, Daniel Miller, was still processing everything, his posture no longer rigid but uncertain, as if the ground beneath what he believed about his own family had become unstable. Around us, the guests had stopped pretending to focus on their plates or their drinks. Instead, they were fully engaged in the unfolding truth, even if none of them felt comfortable acknowledging it out loud. I did not speak immediately because I understood that silence at this point was not empty. It was active. It was allowing realization to settle without interference. I slowly turned my gaze across the room again, not to accuse, but to ensure that everyone understood this was no longer a private disagreement between two individuals, but a reality that had always existed beneath surface appearances. Jessica finally spoke again, but her voice lacked the same structure it had earlier in the evening, and instead of confidence, there was now an attempt to regain emotional control of the situation by reframing what had been said as misunderstanding or exaggeration. She insisted that contributions in a family are not measured in financial terms alone, trying to shift the conversation away from specifics, but the problem was that specifics had already been introduced and could not be removed. I listened without interruption, allowing her words to finish fully, because I wanted everyone present to recognize the difference between assertion and evidence. When she paused, I calmly reiterated that I was not speaking about opinions or interpretations, but about documented responsibilities that had been fulfilled consistently over many years. I explained that stability in a household does not appear by itself, and that in this case it had been maintained through direct financial responsibility that I had carried without public recognition. As I spoke, I noticed that several guests were now looking at each other in silence, not out of judgment, but out of reassessment, as if they were mentally rewriting their understanding of the family dynamic they thought they knew. Daniel finally leaned back slightly in his chair, his expression showing something closer to realization than shock now, as he began to process the difference between what had been assumed and what had actually been sustained. Jessica attempted one more time to regain emotional footing by suggesting that I was bringing up the past unfairly in a social setting, but even that argument did not carry the same weight anymore, because the conversation had already moved beyond perception and into verified reality. I responded only by stating that truth does not become inconvenient simply because it is spoken in front of others, and that ignoring it does not change its existence. The room remained silent after that, but it was no longer the same silence as before. It was a reflective silence, one where understanding was forming even without verbal agreement. I could feel that something fundamental had shifted, not through confrontation but through clarity, and in that moment I understood that control in this room was no longer defined by volume or emotion, but by who held the undeniable facts that could no longer be dismissed. I could feel the room reaching a point where words alone were no longer the main force shaping what was happening, but rather the understanding that had already begun to settle into every person present, and that understanding was growing heavier with each passing second. Jessica Miller remained seated, but her posture had changed again, this time no longer confident or defensive, but tense in a way that suggested she was no longer fully in control of how she was being perceived. My son, Daniel Miller, had stopped looking between us and was now staring down at the table in silence, as if trying to reconstruct a timeline of events that suddenly no longer aligned with what he had believed for years. I stayed standing for a moment longer, not out of confrontation, but because I understood that presence itself had become part of the message that needed to be absorbed without interruption. Then I calmly reached for my chair and sat down, not because the situation required it, but because I had already made the point I needed to make, and anything beyond that would only dilute clarity. There was a long pause in the room, one that no one seemed willing to break, and in that pause I could sense the shift becoming permanent rather than temporary. Jessica finally attempted to speak again, but her voice was quieter now, lacking the structure it had earlier in the evening, and she tried to redirect attention by suggesting that misunderstandings about finances are common in families where roles are shared. However, the problem was no longer about interpretation or roles. It was about documented actions that had already been clearly explained. I did not interrupt her, because I wanted everyone present to recognize that even her attempt to reframe the situation could not restore the version of reality she had been trying to maintain. When she finished speaking, I simply placed both hands on the table and stated calmly that there was no confusion on my part regarding what I had paid for, supported, and maintained over the years, and that those responsibilities were not symbolic but measurable and verifiable. I explained that maintaining a household of this size in Connecticut, including property taxes, maintenance, insurance, and educational expenses, requires consistent financial commitment, and that I had been the one fulfilling that commitment without interruption. I did not raise my voice or add emotional weight, because at this point emotion would have only distracted from clarity. Around the table, I could see guests beginning to shift in their seats slightly, not out of discomfort alone, but because they were now fully processing the contrast between assumption and fact. Daniel finally spoke again, more softly than before, asking if all of this had been happening for years without his awareness, and I simply confirmed that it had, not with blame but with factual acknowledgement. His reaction was not defensive, but deeply reflective, as if he was realizing that absence of information had shaped his entire understanding of his own household. Jessica remained quiet after that, her gaze fixed downward, no longer attempting to correct or challenge the narrative being established in real time. The silence in the room now felt different from earlier moments, no longer tense or expectant, but resolved in a way that suggested the truth had already completed its work. I looked across the table once more and understood that no further explanation was necessary, because the shift in perception had already taken place, and what remained was only the aftereffect of realization settling into memory. I could sense that the atmosphere in the room had shifted into something more stable now, not because the tension had disappeared, but because it had transformed into a kind of quiet understanding that no one was rushing to interrupt. Jessica Miller remained seated in the same position, but her earlier attempts to reshape the conversation had completely stopped, as if she now understood that every additional word would only reinforce the reality already forming in everyone's mind. My son, Daniel Miller, sat very still, his hands resting loosely near his plate, no longer reacting outwardly but clearly processing everything internally in a way that felt deeper than simple surprise. Around us, the guests had also changed their behavior. They were no longer shifting uncomfortably or pretending to focus on small distractions, but instead listening in silence with full attention, as if they were witnessing a moment that would later define how they remembered this entire evening. I did not speak immediately, because I wanted the weight of what had already been said to fully settle before anything else was added, and in that pause I noticed how the absence of noise itself had become part of the message. Jessica finally broke her silence again, but her voice was much lower now, lacking the earlier sharpness or control, and she attempted to soften the situation by suggesting that family responsibilities are often shared in ways that are not always formally tracked or recorded. However, the issue was no longer about interpretation or shared understanding, because what had already been presented was not abstract. It was specific, measurable, and tied directly to years of financial responsibility that had been clearly explained. I looked at her calmly while she spoke, not to challenge her immediately, but to allow everyone present to recognize the difference between general statements and verifiable facts. When she finished, I leaned slightly forward and spoke in an even, steady tone, reiterating that there was no ambiguity in what I had contributed, and that those contributions were not occasional or symbolic but consistent and ongoing over many years. I explained once again that the mortgage payments, property taxes, household maintenance, and educational expenses had all been handled through my own resources, and that each of these commitments had been fulfilled without interruption. I did not raise my voice, because there was no need to compete with emotion when clarity had already established itself as the dominant force in the room. Daniel finally looked up at me again, this time with a different expression, one that carried a mixture of realization and reconsideration, as if he was no longer trying to defend any single version of events but instead trying to understand how so much could have remained unspoken for so long. I did not place blame on him, because what mattered in that moment was not assigning fault, but acknowledging truth, and I told him calmly that I had never intended to hide anything, only to keep the household stable without creating unnecessary conflict. The guests remained silent, but their attention was fully engaged, and I could see subtle shifts in their expressions as they processed how significantly their perception of the family dynamic had changed in such a short period of time. Jessica did not speak again after that, her gaze fixed downward, her earlier confidence now replaced by stillness that suggested she was no longer trying to control the narrative. I looked across the table once more and understood that nothing further needed to be explained, because the truth had already been fully exposed, and what remained was only the quiet realization of how deeply assumptions can be mistaken for reality when they go unchallenged for too long. I could feel the moment in the room begin to settle into a strange kind of final clarity, where no one was speaking not because there was confusion left, but because there was nothing left that could reasonably be denied or reshaped. Jessica Miller remained seated in the same position, but now she was no longer attempting to project confidence or control. Instead, she sat in a quiet stillness that suggested she understood the direction the room had already moved in without her agreement. My son, Daniel Miller, had leaned slightly forward again, resting his forearms on the table, his eyes no longer moving between people but fixed on a single point, as if he was absorbing every detail of what had been revealed and reorganizing his understanding from the ground up. Around the room, the guests were no longer reacting outwardly, but I could see in their faces that they were mentally reconstructing the entire structure of what they had believed about this family. No one was eating anymore, no one was drinking, and even the soft background music from earlier in the evening now felt disconnected from the atmosphere that had formed. I remained seated, hands folded calmly in front of me, not because I had exhausted my words, but because I understood that anything further would no longer be about explanation, but only about allowing reality to complete its own correction. Jessica finally shifted slightly in her chair, and for the first time that night she did not attempt to speak immediately after moving, as if even she recognized that her earlier certainty no longer had a place in the conversation. When she did speak, her voice was quieter and less structured, and she tried to suggest that perhaps misunderstandings had built up over time due to lack of communication within the family, but her words no longer carried influence in the same way they had at the beginning of the evening. There was no immediate agreement, no support, and no validation from anyone at the table, only silence that allowed her statement to exist without reinforcement. I looked at her directly and responded in a calm and steady tone, explaining that communication had never been the issue, but rather assumption, because the financial responsibilities I had carried were not hidden, only unacknowledged by those who benefited from them. I reminded the room that every major expense, from housing stability to long-term educational support for the grandchildren, had been consistently managed through my own financial contributions, and that these were not occasional acts of assistance but sustained responsibilities over many years. As I spoke, I noticed that Daniel's expression softened further, not in opposition, but in understanding, as if he was finally seeing the full scope of what had been quietly maintained in the background of his life. Jessica did not interrupt again, and her silence now felt different from earlier silence in the evening. It was no longer resistance, but withdrawal from a narrative that could no longer be supported. One of the guests shifted slightly in their seat, then another, small movements that reflected internal reassessment rather than discomfort. I did not raise my voice or emphasize any point beyond what had already been stated, because at this stage repetition was unnecessary and emotional intensity would not strengthen what was already clear. Instead, I simply allowed the truth to remain present in its complete form, without distortion or interruption. Daniel finally spoke again, not to challenge or defend, but to ask quietly if I had ever intended for all of this to remain unspoken for so long, and I answered honestly that my intention had always been to maintain stability, not recognition. That answer seemed to land differently in the room, not as justification, but as explanation of a pattern that now made sense in hindsight. Jessica lowered her gaze again and did not respond further, and I could sense that the dynamic in the room had fully shifted into a new equilibrium where perception had permanently adjusted to reality, and nothing from earlier in the evening could restore the illusion that had once existed. I stayed seated in the quiet that followed, not because there was anything left to defend or prove, but because the room itself had entered a state where silence carried more meaning than additional explanation. Jessica Miller remained in her chair, her hands now resting still on the table, no longer attempting to reshape the conversation or redirect attention, as if she understood that the structure she had tried to build earlier in the evening had already collapsed under the weight of clarity. My son, Daniel Miller, looked exhausted in a different way now, not physically but mentally, as if every assumption he had carried about the family he grew up in was being carefully reorganized in real time. Around the table, the guests no longer looked like participants in a dinner gathering, but like witnesses to a moment of correction that none of them could reverse or ignore. I did not speak immediately, because there was no urgency left in the room, only resolution forming slowly and steadily. Finally, I stood up again, not abruptly, but with calm intention, and this time no one reacted with surprise or tension, because my movement no longer represented confrontation but closure. I adjusted my posture and looked around the room once more, not to assert authority, but to acknowledge what had now been fully understood by everyone present. I spoke in a steady and controlled voice, not raising it at any point, and said that everything that needed to be clarified had already been stated clearly, and that there was no further misunderstanding that required correction. I explained once more, briefly and without emotional framing, that the financial responsibilities I had carried for years were not conditional or symbolic, but consistent and fully documented, and that they had supported the stability of the household without interruption. As I spoke, I noticed that no one attempted to interrupt or dispute the statement, not because of intimidation, but because the truth had already been fully absorbed and there was nothing left to argue against that would change it. Daniel finally leaned back slightly in his chair, exhaling slowly as if accepting a reality he had not previously been given the full picture of, and when he looked at me this time, there was no confusion left, only understanding mixed with reflection. Jessica remained still, her gaze lowered, no longer attempting to regain control of perception or narrative, and I could sense that she now understood the irreversible nature of what had been revealed. One by one, the guests began to shift in their seats, not preparing to leave abruptly, but adjusting to the emotional weight of what they had just witnessed, as if the evening had transitioned into its final stage without requiring announcement. I took a step back from the table and allowed a brief pause to exist without speech, because there was no need to extend the moment beyond what it had already become. Daniel finally spoke in a quiet voice, asking if things could have been different if this understanding had existed earlier, and I answered honestly that the past cannot be rewritten, only understood once the truth becomes visible. That response did not create tension, but instead seemed to settle something within him, as if acceptance was replacing confusion. Jessica did not respond at all, and her silence now carried a sense of final withdrawal rather than resistance. I looked once more across the room and understood that what had taken place was not a victory or defeat, but a complete correction of perception, where the truth had quietly replaced assumption without needing force or conflict, and in that final stillness, I turned slightly away from the table, signaling that the conversation had naturally reached its end.